at different points we have both been dubbed, the most dangerous women in Britain, which I always say is the nicest thing the Daily Mail ever said about me.
Nicola Sturgeon.
Hello.
Nicola, welcome to the Speakeasy.
It's a pleasure to be here.
We're calling it the Speakeasy because we want it to be relaxed. Who knows what's in your glass, right?
Yeah, I have a bit of a head cold this morning, so hopefully it's something that will help with that.
Well, hopefully.
Let me taste it.
And we were thinking the vibe of a Speakeasy, yes, it's a little bit illicit, it's a little bit naughty, but it's kind of between the wars, and there's a kind of vibe outside. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit worrying about what might be coming, and there ought to be a safe space to have some of these conversations. But first, I want to congratulate you on your book.
Thank you.
Which is everywhere, and everybody's interested in it here in Scotland, but all over the UK, and for all I know, further afield. So super congratulations on that. It was good. It was a good feeling to write it.
It was great. I mean, I think the writing process was quite cathartic, and getting it out there is also cathartic, and it's a relief. You live with this thing for so long while you're writing it, and then to get it out there feels really good. And I've been in politics for so long, high level of politics for so long. Everybody has an opinion on me. Everybody thinks they know me. Some of it is fair, some of it is not fair. So to put my story out there in my own words feels quite liberating, and then people can read it and make up their own minds.
Complete. Well, look, I want to take you back to a tiny bit of that story that isn't in your book, because it's how I remember you. It's about 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago, I was the director of the human rights group Liberty, and I started reading political journalism, little mutterings in the UK press suggesting that, I think it was Michael Gove, but certainly it was the Tory government, were going to make you an offer you might not refuse, which might have been incredibly attractive to you as First Minister and wanting to campaign for Scottish independence, that in exchange for agreeing to the repeal of the Human Rights Act, Scotland might be offered its own Bill of Rights, and then there could be a Scottish Bill of Rights and an English Bill of Rights, and who knows what else for the rest of the UK. And given my work, I was very, very worried about this, and I could see the potential opportunistic political attraction to you. So I wrote to you and asked if I could come and see you, and you very kindly let me come and see you. And I said, I totally understand the attractions for a party of independence, because the iconography of being offered a Scottish Bill of Rights I would have thought very, very attractive. But I knew that whatever the content, the progressive even content of a Scottish Bill of Rights could have been Human Rights Act Plus, for all I know, that the English equivalent would have been something very, very different. And I remember coming to see you in Edinburgh, sitting in your office with all your officials, and you said very quickly, almost as soon as I sat down, we're not going to do this. And I remember you said, because there are no Scottish rights or English rights or French rights, there are only human rights, universal human rights. And obviously that was music to my ears, and I went back in like a campaigner and said, will you say that publicly? And you said, yes, I will. And then you agreed to give a speech in Govan, here in Glasgow, in your constituency, and I had the privilege of chairing it. And that's how we came to meet. And of course, that was 10 years ago, and now we're at.
I mean, back then, I think we both were concerned about the direction of travel around rights. And, there was lots of talk back then about the repeal of the Human Rights Act, and you've narrated, the particular Scottish element to that. And I was very clear, as you say, you don't trade over human rights. Human rights are human rights, and they are universal. And I was very, very clear about that. But concerned though we were back then, I don't think either of us, not trying to speak for you, but I don't think either of us would have contemplated just how bad things would be 10 years on around rights and equality and, you know, just the discourse generally. Ironically, as an aside, today a UK government wouldn't bother about whether or not Scotland and the Scottish Government agreed to the repeal of the Human Rights Act. They would just override the Scottish Parliament. So there's a bit of a quaintness to think back to the days when they actually worried about what the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government might say. But
the Human Rights Act, of course, is totally baked into the Scotland Act. So,
absolutely. Yeah. So it's, you know, the ECHR is you know, hardwired into the whole establishment of the Scottish Parliament. So before you introduce any legislation in the Scottish Parliament, one of the barriers you've got to cross is to make sure it's not inconsistent with the ECHR. So it's absolutely, you know, hard-baked, hardwired into that settlement, and rightly so. And that's, you know, that can be frustrating at times for governments trying to get things done, but it's a good constraint, and it's a constraint that's there for the right reasons. But, you know, even although, you know, things didn't sort of progress in the way that we feared back then with the Human Rights Act, I think things are much worse than either of us could have ever in our worst nightmares have contemplated. I'm a bit freer to say some of these things now, although I hope I would always have said it. And, you know, it will rile up the right-wing media.
Well, you're sitting with me. I mean, this is really a red rag to a bull,
at different points we have both been dubbed, you know, the most dangerous women in Britain, which I always say is the nicest thing the Daily Mail ever said about me. But the right-wing media will, you know, sort of immediately misrepresent everything I say, which is fine. So, you know, in a sense, I don't really care anymore about that. But the normalisation of far-right rhetoric and language and kind of hate in this country, and not just this country, globally right now, I think is deeply alarming. And I think this is a moment where it would be really easy for people who stand apart from that to be kind of bullied into silence, because it's not easy being a hate figure for the right-wing media. But it's a moment where I think people like us, frankly, have got to stand firm and stand strong, because if we don't do it, then who else can be expected to withstand that?
So those conversations we were having 10 years ago were in the context where my fear certainly was that everyone would pretend that an English Bill of Rights and a Scottish Bill of Rights and would all be just as good, would all deliver on the ECHR, but maybe even better. You know, that was going to be the smokescreen. But I thought it was a smokescreen because I was already feeling the rumblings of very anti-rights, anti-minority, slightly hateful politics, you know, bubbling away. But now people don't bother with the smokescreen. Yeah. They don't even stop at the Human Rights Act. They want the ECHR, which is kind of considered proper Brexit, because the Brexit appetite is an appetite rather than a policy, and it's never stated. And now they want to do for the Refugee Convention, of course, as well.
I think there's been a shift, and whether it's a substantive shift or whether, as you say, it's just people are more open about real motivations now than they were 10 years ago. But, you know, 10 years ago, people would moan about the Human Rights Act or the ECHR, but it would be cloaked in, well, these are well-meaning things, but they're having unintended consequences. They're preventing governments, you know, doing good things, and therefore they have to be kind of reined in. And I'd never agreed with that, but that's one thing. But today it's much more openly, we don't like the human rights legislation, we don't like the ECHR because we don't think these rights should be protected. And that is
they're outdated. They were for another time.
Or they're part of the woke kind of obsession, and we are seeing, I think, on the ground, it is, I think, much more difficult today to be, you know, in an ethnic minority community than it might have been 10 years ago. Not that it was easy. I think it is for many LGBT people. It's more difficult. I think we see global pushback against women's rights, and I think it's deeply troubling. And I think there's all sorts of coalitions sort of cropping up around this. I mean, I get, obviously, I attract a lot of opprobrium on the trans issue, which, so be it. I won't stop standing up for women's rights, nor will I stop standing up for trans rights. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. But when I say what I'm about to say now, I get howls of derision because the right-wing media and others want to suggest that I am saying that everybody who takes a different view to me on trans rights is somehow racist and homophobic and misogynist. I'm not saying that. Two things can be true at once, that many people who disagree with me on the issue, their views are sincerely held, and while I disagree with them, legitimately held by them. But that can coexist with a reality that we have right now. Many people who are hijacking and weaponising the trans issue in order to be a wedge in the war against other rights. And so you will find many people in the trans debate who equally are homophobic and want to push back on gay rights, who, ironically, given that the trans debate is so cloaked in, women's rights and feminist narrative, you get many of these people who want to push back on women's rights. And I just, no matter what side of that debate you're on, I just don't see how anybody can not see that and not concede that. And it's fine to have a difference of opinion on trans issues, but let's not blind ourselves to what is going on around that issue. And it's part of a much bigger pushback
well, I think it's
against
fine
rights and equality.
To have like concerns and questions to ask and issues to resolve around where different vulnerable people should be imprisoned or given refuge or fairness in sport.
Absolutely.
But those are practical policy issues that right-thinking people can get around a table and try and resolve together. That's not the same as some of the visceral
cruelty towards a really vulnerable minority and very, very small
which I have to say, and you may think I'm going too far now, but this is me now. I can only compare it to how it sometimes felt to be the children in an Asian family in the 1970s in London.
Well, I mean, obviously I don't have that experience, so I can't.
But that kind of visceral fear and loathing.
Yeah. We've gone from what you've just described there, a perfectly understandable and legitimate debate about how we balance different rights in different circumstances. And, to be candid, when I was First Minister, maybe I didn't always handle those debates as well as I should have done. But we've gone from that to a situation where there seems to be, and this is not just a byproduct of these debates, it has become on the part of some, and I keep saying this, on the part of some, to be the intention to make life really difficult to live for trans people.
Really small and vulnerable
and for a tiny minority. And we've got ourselves into the position of, believing that the threats women face, and women face, serious threats every single day of our lives, are all from this tiny, group of people in our society. And, there must be a lot of abusive men out there who are thinking, well, hey, we're off the hook here because suddenly the focus is on this tiny minority. There are bad people in every group in society, but in no other group do we sort of taint the whole group by the actions of, a tiny minority of a tiny minority.
I agree. To go back to what you said to me all those years ago, you had me at hello, don't worry, not trading. There are no Scottish rights, English rights, French rights, only universal human rights. I'll be honest, I was a little surprised when you came out with it so quickly and clearly. And I was a little surprised because of Scottish nationalism and of how that internationalism and Europeanism, actually, which you've also displayed in spades, how that squares with what has been a life's work, campaigning for a separate Scottish governance and nation.
And I think those of us in senior positions in the independence movement have to take responsibility for this to some extent, because we haven't I guess, managed to overcome some of the sort of misconceptions about what we stand for. You know, nationalism globally is a word that is, you know, sort of cloaked with connotations of racism and xenophobia.
Particularly in this moment, perhaps,
exactly.
yeah.
Although in many of the countries where far-right nationalism exists and is seen in that way, these are not independence movements. These are in countries that are already independent. I you know, have said in the past and got massive headlines when I said it, if I was to go back to the, you know, before the establishment of my party, the SNP, I wouldn't call it the Scottish National Party, because that word, I think, doesn't properly convey what we stand for. We are an independent self-government movement, and, you know, my sort of belief in independence is of a country that, well, firstly, it doesn't matter where you come from. If you live here, you have a stake in the country and an equal say in the country, and I want people to come and live in Scotland from all over the world and help make us a stronger country, but also a country that is internationalist, an independent country that plays its part in Europe and the world, a voice for peace and progress in the world. So it's a civic self-governance movement, and I think the word nationalism, albeit we mean it in a very different way, for people outside of Scotland, I think has in the past given a very different sense of what we stand for and what we represent.
That's helpful, the way you put it like that. But the other challenge I felt to those different parts of your political identity in your book is not just with, you know, perceived nationalism versus internationalism, but with the left of centre progressive values that you espouse and which are clear in the book, and I think have been a distinction in your public life with perhaps some of your predecessors. I suppose what I would want to ask is, if so much money is being hoarded in the City of London on this shrinking interconnected planet, why would it ultimately make sense to make it harder to redistribute some of that wealth to some of the poorest parts of Glasgow by the separateness of a separately governed nation?
I don't think that's how it works or would work. So Scotland, as an independent country, would have levers to... I don't think an independent Scotland would ever compete directly with the City of London, but we are the second biggest financial centre in the UK. We don't have the same levers that a country like Ireland has to attract more investment. So I think by becoming independent, it's not just trying to sort of redistribute, and within the sort of Westminster framework, we could become a more vibrant country in our own right economically. And we then have the same challenges of tackling inequality in our own country and redistribution. But there's a fundamental democratic point about Scottish independence as well, that we so often find ourselves, you know, having to deal with the consequences of policies we have never, ever democratically endorsed or approved. So, you know, my political awakening back in the 1980s came when Thatcher was Prime Minister, decimating economically the kind of community I was growing up in. And, you know, that feeling would have been the same as a young person in Newcastle or Liverpool, but the additional factor in Scotland, which, you know, ultimately took me into the SNP and not Labour, which much of my background and political leanings would have suggested is where I would have ended up, is that there was no, you know, Scotland is a nation, it's not a region of the UK, and we'd never voted, you know, for Thatcher. Scotland voted Labour in, you know, spades back then.
So it's
but
a there is a cultural aspect, you know, every time you hear a piper or some Burns. Or...
I don't think, I mean, yeah, I love Robert Burns. I think it's, you know, this
so do I.
Ploughman from not far from where I was born and grew up in a very impoverished kind of family, became somebody who is one of the literary giants of the world today. There are more statues of Robert Burns around the world than almost any other historical figure. I think Queen Victoria, Christopher Columbus, maybe I think Nelson Mandela, and then Robert Burns. So I sometimes think, you know, why did Robert Burns back then be able to become this sort of literary giant, poetic genius? It's because Scotland was one of the countries that pioneered free universal education. Robert Burns in almost any other country in the world would have been illiterate when he was growing up. That's an aside, but it's a way of saying, yes, of course there's a great cultural pride in Scottishness and Scottish identity, but that's not just what drives the independence movement. I don't even think today it's principally what drives the independence movement. I represent a constituency just across the River Clyde from where we are right now, with the biggest Pakistani community in Scotland, smaller but still sizable Indian community, lots of immigration from Eastern Europe, and you will find really strong support for independence in these communities. So it's partly cultural, but it's partly about how do we best control our own destiny democratically. Brexit illustrates this probably better than anything else. 2/3 of people in Scotland voted to stay in the EU, and here we are out with no say in the matter. Yeah. So that's the argument for independence.
And one of the arguments that was thrown at you during the independence referendum was you'll lose your place.
Apparently,
in Europe.
yeah. I mean, and some of the same people who took us out of the EU just a couple of years later, in 2014, that was the argument. If Scotland votes yes, you'll be chucked out of the EU because you won't be the member state. So,
and now the member states walked out.
Exactly. So, just to bring this to a conclusion, I get why people outside Scotland maybe don't fully understand this or have a different perception, but the Scottish independence movement, it is a project for internationalism, for progressive politics, for greater equality. That's not to say everybody who supports Scottish independence is of these views. Like any movement, there'll be, there's some supporters of Scottish independence who voted for Brexit. So there will be people with a different
But
motive.
that was your vision.
And I think it was the vision of and if you look back to the independence referendum, that was the vision that very much drove the Yes campaign.
Nonetheless, again in your book, you do talk about social conservatism even within the SNP.
Yeah.
Within Scotland, within the world, but within the SNP, and you having to navigate that.
Yeah, I think it's important that we don't, and Scotland can be, a bit bad for this and are prone to this, and I, as part of that can be a sense of Scottish exceptionalism that we somehow stand, separate from, these worrying trends that we see. Scotland historically, has a strong sort of strand of social conservatism. We're the country of John Knox, Calvinism. I think we had a lengthy period leading up to and coming out of the independence referendum where I think we all thought we had absolutely decisively and irreversibly moved on from that. The Scottish Parliament, when it passed equal marriage legislation, it was one of the biggest parliamentary majorities for that had been seen in the world at the time. But I think we've been reminded in the last few years that as this global culture wars have erupted again, that Scotland is not immune from that strand of social conservatism and reactionary views on things. I don't think it is anywhere near a majority opinion in Scotland, but we can't be complacent. Racism exists in Scotland, sexism exists in Scotland, homophobia exists in Scotland, and if we don't kind of level with that, and if people like me are not open-eyed about that, then the danger is, we're kind of slightly blinded to it and don't see the things that we need to, stand up to and continue to fight for the progress that we've made.
Which I think takes us back to your story and the burden, the privilege, but also the responsibility of leadership, which you are better qualified to talk about than most people, having been right at the centre of things for so long. You talk to lots of journalists and other people about this in recent weeks, since the book came out, and even before. It comes at great personal cost, doesn't it?
I mean, the first thing I would say is that leadership is a privilege, and that's the overriding kind of sense I have. I look back on the extraordinary political career I've had and think I don't regret any of that. But I think it is important for somebody at my stage of politics and my stage of career is to be kind of candid about the ups and downs of leadership if we are to openly and honestly encourage the next generation to sort of step forward into these positions. I think somebody like me, from my background and my personality, there's a sort of personal cost that maybe I didn't have to pay, of becoming so single-minded to sort of overcome the natural shyness and imposter syndrome and, foregoing some of the other things that I might have done in life. But then I think there is a more universal element to this, which I think is particularly the case for women. And in this climate we're in today, for women on the left, if you kind of, I don't know, threaten an establishment's view of the world, which as a woman of the left leading a campaign that came very close to breaking up the UK, I kind of fit that category, then, the characterization of you, the treatment on, by some of the media can be really brutal. And I'm not, don't get me wrong, I was a very senior politician. I should have been and was subject to, very robust scrutiny. But the gendered aspect to that, the sort of vitriol, particularly now, of that.
And if you're black like Diane Abbott, then you get even more or just as much.
And, Diane Abbott, gets that more than I do because she's a black woman. I've seen some of the coverage of Angela Rayner over the years, and these are people I don't agree with politically, but I identify with a lot of the treatment that they're getting because in Angela's case, she's a working class woman threatening, the view of a lot of powerful men, or threatening their worldview. Even, somebody whose decisions in the last year I do really disagree with, Rachel Reeves. I think if she was a male chancellor, I think the sort of public characterisation of her would be very different. So there's totally a gendered
And is this
assessment.
worse because of social media?
I think it's absolutely worse because of social media, because a lot of the abuse that women and minorities get, and some men get as well, through social media, it can get at you much more directly than it was. So if I look back on, my career, and if I look back to comparing now with my early days in politics, on the upside, the good side, there are many more women in senior positions, and so there's more, not quite a critical mass, but closer to a critical mass of women there. Absolutely on the downside is the change in public discourse, and that is driven by social media. Politics, public life, I think, is a much more hostile environment for women today.
Because of social media.
Absolutely.
And it's sort of set a trend that even more conventional media has kind of followed, hasn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a journalist, I'm not an expert on how to sell newspapers, so this is very much a layperson's view, although I'm on the other side of the media. But I think the mainstream media, to use that term, has made a real mistake in how it's responded to social media. Instead of trying to, you can never compete with social media in terms of the clickbait, snappy,
controversy,
dramatic, controversy driven headlines. But that's what the mainstream media, or big chunks of it, have tried to do. So, and their circulation figures are falling all the time. I think, well, my view is if they had tried to provide more of an alternative to social media.
We are the trusted brand.
We are the trusted brand.
There's lots of noise.
Here's the long form, trusted, way in which you can get, the facts or intelligent opinions on things, which some, papers have done, but not very many. Then I think we might be seeing a very different media environment just now.
So on the subject of being the trusted voice, in very scary times, COVID must have been a moment, obviously awesome responsibility for someone in leadership, but also in contrast with, say, some of the leadership south of the border, you were a trusted voice to millions and millions of people on both sides of the border, actually, because of the way that you handled, in particular, those daily briefings when people are all locked down and so on. But watching you subsequently give evidence at the inquiry, that really took its toll on you. That was hard to watch, Nicola, if I may say so.
Yeah, COVID was really grim for everybody. And I had a tough job to do, but it wasn't the toughest in the country by any stretch of the imagination. I got lots of things wrong. I think everybody got lots of things wrong because we were flying blind a lot of the time. And I know that I made the best judgments I could every day. And I made a decision early on that I wanted to, effectively have an open conversation with the public about what we knew, what we didn't know, why we were doing certain things. And I think that became important for the country. It was important for me. It helped me sort of navigate through a really difficult situation as well. And to this day, there is rarely a day goes by, certainly almost never a week goes by, where I don't have people talking to me about those briefings and saying, they helped me get through. So I think there was something there in just the style of leadership that I think is important. You can never replicate the conditions of a global pandemic. I had an audience of people sitting, in their houses watching that. But I think there's something in that, just trying to communicate in a more open and candid way with people that might serve as well more generally. COVID definitely hastened, the end of my tenure as First Minister. I think it took me a while to realise this after we came out of the pandemic, just how much it had exhausted me physically and mentally. And my 8.5 years as First Minister probably felt a lot longer than that because of the COVID years. And then by the time we got to the inquiry, and this is not a criticism of the inquiry, I'd been through other torrid times, and sitting in the inquiry, expecting to be, questioned really closely about decisions I'd taken and believing that's important, suddenly found myself sort of confronted with all the worst caricatures of myself that I'd been politically motivated, taking decisions, to try to deliberately differentiate Scotland from the rest of the UK. I was a control freak. Incidentally, I don't think I sort of, and this is not a comment about the inquiry, but generally not language that would tend to be used by strong male leaders. No. They're just strong leaders. And I just found that really hard to deal with in the moment, and did that thing that I think every woman in public life dreads doing, which is breaking down, because you know that it will be on the part of some immediately, presented as a sign of weakness, or you can't cope. And then in the weeks after that, finding myself very close to the edge of a breakdown. And, quickly by
because
taking
you'd internalised the criticism, or you said just a few moments ago, I made some mistakes. What do you think were your mistakes? That you were still...
the inquiry's still sitting, so I'm slightly hesitant to sort of go in too much to that, because I don't want to second guess it. But one thing I've said openly, I think the whole country should have gone into lockdown sooner. So
that's the whole UK, though.
The whole UK. And Scotland couldn't have done it unilaterally because we didn't hold the financial levers. But, maybe I should have pushed harder. We did start to push and do, we banned mass gatherings a bit sooner. We forced the pace on closing schools. So these are the things I will always kind of carry with me. Could we have done more? Could we have lessened the toll of COVID? And I don't know what the answer to that is. If we'd suppressed it more earlier, it might have, burst back with more of a vengeance later. But I think the inquiry, if it had happened without all the other things I'd been dealing with since stepping down, it might not have had that impact on me. I think it became a bit of a straw that broke the camel's back. And I went through a really dark period of internalising all of that, being unable to sort of get myself out of this sense that taking delivery of some of the worst critics a little bit. Kind of allowing that to get into my head, all these caricatures of me that my sworn critics will want people to believe. I started to sort of think, maybe I am like that. Maybe I am responsible for all the people who died. And so it was a really tough time. I did something I'd never done before or since, but probably something we should maybe all of us feel more comfortable to do more often. I took some professional counselling, and that helped me a lot to, probably more quickly than would otherwise have been the case.
Well, some people go to the gym because they want to lose weight, or they've got a sporting injury, and then they keep going and think, actually, this is part of a healthy life.
I started going to the gym last year, and I have not been at all in the last few weeks because I've been so caught up with the book stuff, and I need to get back to it. But
you see the analogy I'm making.
I started to go for physical reasons but very quickly realised that everything people say about the impact of exercise on your mental health is absolutely correct. So I think we should, and I think society is more open about, mental health discussions than we used to be. But the reason I talked in my book about, taking some professional help around that time is I think we still need to do more to normalise that actually that's not a bad thing and it's not a sign of weakness.
No.
These are the kind of things we should be much more open about.
But of course, a pandemic, like so many other threats facing the world, is an international problem that ultimately requires international response.
Absolutely.
To my mind, I just cannot get over the fact that Big Pharma and its friends in global politics did not agree to trigger the TRIPS waiver, so that when those vaccines had been developed, they could be truly shared with the world. And I will just never forget, the Serum Institute of India manufacturing vaccines to send to the West, whilst dead bodies floated down the Ganges River.
I look back on the development of the vaccines, and I feel at one in the same time, an incredible sense of pride at the sort of scientific and achievement that was to so quickly get these vaccines developed and into production and into people's arms. But on the other hand, the global failure to make sure they were equitably distributed. And I look back on COVID now, and when we were in it, I think there was this sense of it was such a big disruption to life as we knew it that we would never all just drift back to the way things had been, that it would spark a
It would be a
different
1945
attitude.
moment.
Exactly, that we'd all become, domestically but globally, we'd all become much more interconnected and concerned about each other. And, that hasn't happened, and we've kind of all slipped back more quickly than I think anybody would have anticipated. I think there's a legacy to COVID that we don't yet fully understand and appreciate, and I think it will be with us for a long time. And I, carry a lot of, I don't know what the right word is, because I don't want to use guilt, because I was doing the best I could in the moment, but
trauma, perhaps.
Or responsibility, a sense of responsibility for the decisions we took that had such an impact on young people's lives, on their education, on those in society who already had the least. I mean, it was fine, and during lockdown it wasn't fine for anybody, but it's one thing if you were living in a big house with a garden. If you were 3 floors up,
every inequality was heightened. Every inequality,
exactly,
domestically and on the planet, was heightened. But for me, it's not even just vaccine distribution, but given that most people on the planet had to give up some of their normal rights and freedoms and ability to earn money and all the rest of it, the fact that Big Pharma couldn't share the recipe, that, when those vaccines were developed, some of them even in the UK, the fact that recipe couldn't be Creative Commons, so that countries in the global south and poorer countries couldn't produce them.
I think, so I don't disagree with that at all. But I think it is one example, albeit a very big example, of one of the issues we have to grapple with in society. A lot of what is driving some of the political trends that we're talking about right now is inequality. A sense that, people are really struggling financially, socially, and you've got people like Nigel Farage, Donald Trump, their followers, exploiting that, but trying to tell people, scapegoat, why is the working class guy in Glasgow struggling? It's, well, women's rights have gone too far, or it's gay rights, or it's immigrants coming in and refugees. Instead of, and people on my side of the political spectrum have to have more of a backbone in standing up and saying, well, actually, the reason people are really, really struggling is because too much of the wealth and influence has been hoarded by a tiny, tiny percentage of people at the top. And by the way, the Farages and the Trumps of this world are part of that. And so it suits them to make you think it's somebody else so that they can carry on doing what they're doing. And I one of my frustrations, and I guess coming out of elected politics, maybe just feeling a bit less inhibited about saying these things is, you know, we need more of a progressive fight back against this, instead of what seems to me at the moment of too many so-called progressive leaders is kind of trying to emulate what Farage and Trump are doing, as opposed to standing up and providing a very stark alternative that is also capable of inspiring a bit of hope and aspiration in people.
Hope.
It's in short supply at the moment.
It's in short supply.
But I'm a great believer that why be in politics, why be in public life if you're not prepared to stand up for what you believe in? And we're at a time where, for somebody like me, standing up for the things I believe in is harder than it's been at any point in my lifetime. And there's not a day goes by, probably, maybe there is, but it doesn't feel like it sometimes, when I'm not being demonised and castigated.
But is it easier to park that now that you're not? Because when you're, I've often thought this, that my sort of brief compared to you, little sojourn into party politics has vindicated my choice never to stand for election, because I don't think I was temperamentally suited to the levels of hate, really. And you talked about the misogyny and how hard it is for women and black women, and so on. But now that you're not going to be, well, now that you're not First Minister, you're not the leader of a party.
I'm not going to be standing for election.
You're not going to be standing for another election.
So yeah, in some ways it is easier just to park that. But I think it's important. A lot of young women in particular talk to me about, you know, should I come into politics or whatever. So I think it's important for somebody like me not to sort of pretend that kind of stuff has no personal impact on you.
But I mean, for example, now you cannot look at social media, right? Or you're just addicted to it?
No, I'm not. I'm breaking that addiction.
Right.
So I can pick and choose what I look at. Yeah. So yes, on one level it's easier. Frankly, the Daily Mail pours hate on me every day, every week, whatever. So in a sense, you know.
But it's been so many years.
And it's been so many years. And actually, there's a lot more love in my life than there is hate, and that helps as well. Since I published the book, I've done events where I've probably spoken to getting close to 10,000 people in the space of a couple of weeks, and what that has told me is there's a lot of people out there yearning for something different. They're yearning for hope. They're yearning for inspiration. So I think the point I'm making is, even though still in elected politics, you can't just kowtow to this.
No.
Or, what are you there for? We've got to stand up and fight back. It might take a while. Things might get worse before they get better. I think that is a distinct possibility. But you've got to stand up for what you believe in. You've got to stand on the side of people who are, whatever hate I might get from the right-wing media, it's nothing compared to, what some minorities are getting from certain quarters these days. So you've got to stand shoulder to shoulder with people who need your support and solidarity.
Isn't it? It's an old-fashioned word, but it's
and just fight for what you think is important and believe in. And I'm not going to be, in a few months I won't be in Parliament for the first time in more than a quarter of a century, but I've got a voice and I've got a platform, and I won't be bullied into silence, because I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is the kind of establishment vested interest trying to bully people into sort of keeping their head down and being silent. And I'm not going to be bullied into silence, because I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent in the face of some of what's happening right now.
And you said yourself, this culture war, anti-woke stuff is a distraction from the real challenges facing the planet and the injustice.
Absolutely. I mean,
of wealth being hoarded, power being hoarded.
Yeah, exactly. And narratives are being turned on their head, realities are being turned on their head. The sort of powerful, vested interests are managing to convince people that it's action to tackle climate change that's causing some of the problems they're dealing with, not climate change itself. And those vested interests control a lot of the media vehicles, and so it's really difficult just now to stand up to some of this, but it's got to be done, or democracies everywhere are in a pretty sugly peg. And and the planet is in a pretty dodgy position.
And you've been, again, you do talk about the climate emergency in the book and the tensions of being in leadership in Scotland, where, let's face it, for many years, fossil fuels in the North Sea were going to be the easy way to independence.
But, North Sea oil and gas is the North Sea is a very mature basin, declining resource. Even without the climate emergency, the reserves of North Sea oil and gas in just a few years will be a tiny, tiny percentage of what they are now. So there's a driving imperative, even if the climate emergency didn't exist, to make the transition to renewables and other sources of energy. And I firmly believe that those who argue for maximum exploration, maximum extraction from the North Sea, not only are they doing the wrong thing for the planet, they're doing the wrong thing for the people whose jobs depend on that industry right now, because we're deluding ourselves, because that industry needs to transition. And I compare it to...
And it needs to be a just transition.
And it needs to be a just transition. And you don't... Every pound, every, ounce of labour or, investment effort that goes into trying to explore new oil and gas reserves in the North Sea, most of which will end up being exported anyway, is a pound and labour, an effort that's not going into the alternative.
Even a small percentage of those profits going back decades had been invested.
Well, you look at Scotland compared to Norway. Norway's oil fund, fund for future generations. Scotland's got, very little to show for oil and gas, but that's a different debate. But I really believe that those who are arguing for maximum extraction of oil and gas are doing a real disservice to those whose jobs depend on that. But I've found myself, in the face of this onslaught of, because I argue a different thing, I'm the one that was threatening these jobs. And I compare it to, again, what drove me into politics in the 1980s, living in a community that was dealing with the impacts of deindustrialisation. I grew up in an old mining community, and, transitions that were inevitable, but with a government that didn't really care about the human impact of them. And if we allow that to happen around oil and gas, then we'll be repeating those mistakes.
There's an irony with Margaret Thatcher, isn't there? Because
there's lots of things with Margaret Thatcher.
There's lots of things, and I'm not talking about silly comparisons. And her 1989 speech to the UN General Assembly is extraordinary, and I cite it in my latest book, Human Rights: The Case for the Defence. She's warning about climate change. Back in 1989, devotes her entire speech to the General Assembly to that. But you won't see any of that remembered in the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and whatever. At the same time, though, no just transition for those miners and those mining communities that become really devastated for generations to come.
Well, where I grew up, there is still the scars and the legacy impact of what happened back in the 90s, or what didn't happen back in the 1980s in terms of helping people into new jobs.
And are you satisfied that within your means, within your remit and the tools at your disposal?
Well, I don't have any remit anymore.
No, but that you had a reasonable industrial strategy.
No, I don't. I think it would be wrong to look back and say we did everything we should have done. We were certainly, when I was First Minister, and I think my successors in government now in Scotland are still trying to do this, of make sure that we are supporting that transition. The investment in renewables in Scotland, the expansion of offshore wind, for example, the work that's going into green hydrogen is all really important. I think it needs to be accelerated, and I think this constant debate about, do we just keep extracting as much oil and gas as possible versus the alternative becomes a bit of a distraction from what we need to do. But I think governments everywhere have to get more real about the climate emergency and about what needs to happen economically as we make those transitions. Unfortunately, I think it is one of the areas where we're probably seeing things go backwards rather than forwards.
As part of this lurch to the far right.
As part of this sense that, equality, rights, tackling climate change, all of these things that are just about trying to build a better planet and better societies where people can be happier and healthier and, you know, more fulfilled and be themselves. I know that sounds a bit Pollyanna, but all of that now being characterised as some kind of woke, you know, agenda to undermine people, and that the capture of that kind of narrative and the conveying of that kind of narrative, I think is setting us back hugely. And on things like climate change, you know, we don't have this is, you know, as the UN, I went to many COP summits over my time, including the one here in Glasgow, and, you know, this was described years ago as the decisive decade in terms of tackling climate change. And here we are halfway through it. And it's not just that we are not making enough progress fast enough. We're going backwards.
So do you think this might be a particular thread of your speaking and campaigning in the time ahead?
So the things I care about are, you know, equalities, human rights, and not human rights in some abstract sense, but human rights. And I think that's we've talked about this, I think, in the past as well, about the need to be clear that human rights are for all of us.
Yeah.
They're not abstract. So I care about that. I care about, you know, climate change. I care about the opportunities young people have in our society today. So these are the kind of things I will want to, in whatever way I can, choose to continue to speak out about.
And it might be a bit easier on, you know, the way you describe your personality and the tension between having to be so incredibly public and the shy person. Maybe this life with your writing and your campaigning, but extra parliamentary, might be at this stage in life a happier equilibrium.
I think I've already found a much happier balance in my life between the kind of public and the private. I've just published a book, so the kind of public side seems to have
satisfied
gone
for a bit,
sky high again. But you know, the book for me was always people. I don't know that I'll ever, certainly not for the foreseeable future, be able to live an entirely private life. Certainly not in Scotland. But the book, I think, has always represented for me something of a bridge between, you know, my old very public life and a life where I get to redraw the boundaries a little bit. And
do you think that was a trade-off? Do you think that's why you were so revealing in some respects?
It may not work this way, and time will tell, but I think that was part of my calculation.
Right.
You know, here is my story in my words. I've opened up a lot, and so you've got that now. And so coming out of that, I'm not
just give me a bit of space.
Naive. I don't think I can. Having written a book like that, I don't have the right to suddenly say, well, you're not allowed to be interested in my life anymore. And I don't think that is a feasible thing. But I do think, and I'm certainly going to do this, I'm going to try to redraw the boundaries between public and private and reclaim more of a private life. We'll see how it works, but that is definitely my intention.
It shouldn't be a contradiction to have a private life but still be socially engaged. I mean, in the end, that's human nature, isn't it? I mean, that's kind of human rights for me. Human rights reflect the creatures that we are, which is that we are precious individuals who shouldn't be degraded and tortured and enslaved and need to think and speak and so on. But we're social creatures too. We want to be in the world, and goodness me, you've been in the world. Yeah.
So when I was First Minister, and I think again going back to COVID, you know, for a year, more than a year, I was literally in everybody's living room every single day. I think it's understandable that the sort of media scrutiny on me got even greater than would normally be the case with a senior politician. There is an interest in what I'm doing and such like, and I get that, and I'm not, you know, complaining about that, but I do think there is a different balance to be struck, and the Daily Mail can like it or lump it, but I am not going to give a running commentary from now on about my private life and all the rest of it, and I'm going to try and draw these boundaries while still being able to speak out and contribute hopefully positively to the things I care about.
Well, look, it's really good to see you rested, a bit rested.
Apart from this terrible head cold that
Apart
I've
from the head
got.
cold, and certainly in a place of resilience, and you brought up hope, and that's incredibly important for all of us.
I think hope is a human right. I think
in
any sort of, whether it's in our private lives and in terms of the state of the world, if we lose hope, we kind of lose some essential bit of ourselves. And my book, you know, it goes into great detail about some of the challenges and sort of dark times I've faced in my life, which, you know, people have faced much worse stuff than I have. But it goes into all of that. But fundamentally, it ends on, for me personally, it ends on a note of hope and resilience and, you know, looking forward to the future. And I think it's really important, even in these dark times in a more sort of public sphere, that we hold on to that sense of it will get better. Yeah. You know, maybe the whole saying, you know, is always darkest before the dawn. Maybe it does get a bit darker before it starts to get lighter again, but it will get lighter again, and it will get lighter more quickly if people continue to fight back and stand up for the things they believe in.
Hear, hear. Nicola Sturgeon, thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure.